I'm delighted today to be joined by Tony Arend, who is, as Stephanie mentioned, Professor of Government and Foreign Service at Georgetown, and now also the chair of the Government Department. And I wanted to mention that Tony's also working with us here at GU Press on a book series about the future of the international system. So Tony, thank you for joining us.
A pleasure, Al, as always. Thank you, and thank you for everything the press is doing.
You're welcome. Thank you. And so I think we wanted to talk with you again because so much has happened in the 3 months since we spoke in April. And it also seems fitting that we speak today on the 75th anniversary of the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. So last time we spoke in very broad terms about the future of the international system. And this time I thought we could focus a bit more on America's role in the world and the effect of the pandemic on the international system and America's standing in the world. And it's been striking to me that over the last few months, the US has not only kind of failed to control COVID-19 domestically, but it's also failed to provide international leadership in dealing with the pandemic. So I wanted to start by asking you, is this the first time since World War II, let's say, that that there's been a major international crisis and the US has kind of been off to the side and not leading the response?
So I think it is. I mean, we've seen the United States take the back seat when a number of other things were going on, certain financial crises abroad when the United States didn't engage perhaps as much as it should. But if you think of this, after World War II, the United States really did step into a tremendous leadership position, and pretty much every major event, the United States was engaged one way or another. And now American leadership is woefully failing. America's ability to work with multilateral institutions and with other states is failing. And I think much of the world is looking for leadership and really wondering what has happened to the United States.
Yeah. Do you see any other countries or blocks of countries kind of stepping into that void at the moment?
You know, I mean, a little bit. I mean, we've seen Angela Merkel in Germany and Emmanuel Macron in France trying to step up and play a role. I mean, certainly China is trying to play, not so much in managing this global crisis, but in trying to assert itself and take advantage of the lack of American leadership. But the British have not. Surprisingly, you would expect in previous days that might have been the case. And so there's really been a vacuum where the lack of U.S. leadership has not immediately been filled by other powers or other actors in the international system.
Thank you. So looking out a little bit, how damaging would you say is the U.S.'s handling of the pandemic been to its standing in the world? So not just the failure to control the health side of things, but also the kind of really stark partisan and racial divides that this situation has revealed.
So the United States, I think, was already in a bad position with respect to global leadership. And you can go back to, the America First rhetoric. You can go back to President Trump's inaugural address where he said as much. And he said that the United States was going to retreat, that the United States was not going to engage in the kind of active role in foreign policy that it had previously. Matter of fact, it's remarkable if you contrast, say, President Trump's inaugural address with President Kennedy's inaugural address. You see two very, very different pictures of what America means and what global leadership means. So that was already coming. And the United States' really critical attitude towards its allies, towards NATO, an unwillingness to engage in multilateral institutions and global arrangements. So that was already happening. And then the pandemic strikes, and what you would have expected, and I would argue under any other president in recent memory, so under Obama, under Bush, under Clinton, under Reagan, under George Herbert Walker Bush, what you would have expected was for the United States to step up and play this leadership role, working through institutions like the World Health Organization. I mean, we saw that, for example, with AIDS and the role that was played by President George W. Bush. We saw it in the Ebola crisis with Obama. And so you would have expected that normally to happen. But coming upon already several years of withdrawal and disengagement, this was just either, depending on how you want to conceptualize it, a nail in the coffin or a straw on the camel's back that further indicated that the United States was not stepping up and playing a leadership role.
Thank you. So the first part of your answer kind of anticipated my next question, which was to sort of rewind a little bit to America First and to ask whether you think this is a coherent foreign policy and whether it's been successful on its own terms.
So, easy answer to the question is no, it's not a coherent foreign policy. But it's complicated, I think, as to why it isn't a coherent foreign policy. I see the America First rhetoric, again, embodied in President Trump's inaugural address, as manifesting an attitude of nationalism, what we used to call isolationism, that is reflected in and I would use this term, sort of political theory of someone like a Steve Bannon, who was in the administration, or a Stephen Miller, who's currently in the administration. I think there was, if you will, sort of a coherence. I would disagree with it, but nonetheless, a coherence to that. But the problem has been, first of all, I think it's misfounded and dangerous for the world and dangerous for the United States. But even assessing that, the problem about it being coherent is that the president has engaged with people that he seems to want to engage with and disengage with people that he doesn't want to. So despite all this, there's been an engagement with Russia. There's been an engagement with Saudi Arabia. There has been a participation in a variety of foreign policy activities that a pure American First policy, if it were coherent, wouldn't have indicated. And I think that just deals with personal preference and a seeming affinity on the part of the president for authoritarian leaders. So people like Putin, Mohammed bin Salman, Erdogan, Duterte, and so on, and even Kim Jong-un to a large degree. Even initially, President Xi in China, but it looks as though what's happened lately is that China seems to be a whipping boy or a scapegoat for COVID-19. And while there had been a bit of a trade war going on, now that challenge to China seems to have escalated, and you really seem to see a combative role that the United States is taking towards China, blaming, if you will, China for COVID-19.
Thank you. So would you say that Trump's foreign policy has been successful on its own terms?
Well, I mean, I guess it goes down to how we define success. Because of the incoherence and it not being able to be implemented, if you look at, there's an American First concept, and it's episodic, it's not really being implemented, you could say, no, it hasn't been successful. In terms of the goals of having this affinity for people like Putin or Erdogan and Mohammed bin Salman and so on, has that worked? I mean, I guess you'd have to ask, has it worked to what end? In other words, has it advanced foreign policy goals? And the strange affinity to Russia hasn't made Russia less problematic. It hasn't kept Russia from trying to interfere in United States affairs. It hasn't gotten Russia out of Crimea. And these are all things that were supposedly generally part of US foreign policy. So I'd say, first of all, on its own terms, it's not coherent. And even if you look at the specific things that have been done, again, the support for Russia and so on, I don't think it has achieved even what its advocates might have wanted it to achieve, right, which would be a promotion of America's interest and a strengthening of the United States economy, for example.
Right, thank you. Do you see any continuity with the foreign policy of the last Republican administration?
No, I mean, not really.
Yeah.
I guess I would say a couple things. I think that there was a tremendous continuity in American foreign policy from the beginning of the Cold War to the end of the Cold War. Tremendous continuity. And I may have said that previously when we chatted. There were little nuances here or there, but there wasn't fundamentally a difference between Truman's foreign policy and Eisenhower's foreign policy, or Nixon's foreign policy and Carter's foreign policy. Again, the nuances here or there, and people argue that Carter was less effective as a foreign policy executor than, say, was Reagan and so, but still fundamentals. What we saw at the end of the Cold War was the need to develop a coherent foreign policy and a strategy, which I don't think any administration since George Herbert Walker Bush was able to do. Now, that having been said, to your specific question, if we go to George W. Bush, so George W. Bush's administration was very much an engagement with the globe. First, an affirming of allies which had existed, again, going back to the beginning of the Cold War. So that continued, that affirmation of allies. But it was a much more muscular, you had the neocons in the administration who were advocating things like the Iraq War and the like, and democracy promotion was part of that. And again, there was a lot of other things going on. Fighting AIDS, for example, is a very important part. Fighting human trafficking in the George W. Bush administration. Now, fast forward to Trump. So the first thing we've seen is, again, a disregard for our alliances and for the multilateral connections that the Bush administration supported. Secondly, we've seen a reluctance to engage globally with a view to pulling troops out here, pulling troops out there. And some would say, well, the neocons went too far, but this also seems to be, to many observers' sense, going too far and also lacking coherence.
Yes.
For instance, recent decision to move troops out of Germany, or a number of troops out. Like, why? What is the purpose of that? And the only thing you can end up saying is it seems to be intended to somehow punish Germany for not contributing more portion of their GNP to NATO. And that seems silly and seems to misunderstand the reason we have troops there and the reason we have alliances. So I don't see any real connection between the previous Republican administration. You saw their support of allies. You saw their sort of a willingness to understand the role of multilateral institutions. Yes, you saw more of an engagement internationally, which to many people went too far, like with the Iraq War. And now you see a pulling back from that. So I see them as fundamentally different, which is one reason why I think there are a lot of Republican foreign policy experts who have strongly opposed Trump's foreign policy, because they see it as, first of all, breaking with 75 years of commitment to certain institutions, and they see it as incoherent with respect to other things. I mean, the other thing, simply put, is there was, during the Bush administration, a calling out of Russia or China for human rights violations and for things like this. And I think a lot of those former Bush administration people are mystified that much of this is tolerated now.
Right. Yeah, the decision to withdraw troops from Germany strikes me as maybe being motivated by re-election as much as anything, because I think Trump feels he promised to withdraw troops from somewhere, and withdrawing them from Afghanistan and Iraq has proved trickier than maybe he thought. So yeah, it doesn't feel strategic in any sense, I think. So I wanted to ask a question that's come in the Q&A. So one participant's written, I'm struck by how often Trump rails against anarchists. Do you think it's fair to say that Trump himself is an anarchist when it comes to the international scene, say, for instance, in governance of the high seas or climate change?
Well, that's a really good, interesting observation. Well, without trying to get too much into a definition of what an anarchist, I think of Mikhail Bakunin's book on or writings on anarchy, and he actually said anarchy is a creative art somehow. I mean, so we think of sort of this utter anarchy as if anarchy simply means no government, and so we think of people that want to do that. Autarkic might be a way to describe Trump. Now, if you look at it for those international relations scholars out there, you know that Kenneth Waltz said that the international system was a system of formal anarchy. Now, what he meant by that is that there was no common power. There was no centralized legislative, executive, judicial authority, and that meant that there was a formal anarchy. You had a group of sovereign states that did their own thing. Waltz told the truth, but it might have been more complicated than that. That having been said, I would certainly think that Trump would support the reinforcement of that idea of formal anarchy, meaning, and his inaugural address says this, he says, we're going to strengthen our state, we're going to engage in our national interest, and we want the rest of you in the world to do that. So yes, I guess in that sense. Now, if we're thinking of, you know, bomb-throwing anarchists, that's not, I think, in any kind of real, not even a metaphorical sense. Maybe you could argue he's throwing bombs in the international system, but not in any real sense. But in sort of a theoretical sense, yes, he wants to affirm the idea of a sovereign state and the idea of the sovereign state as sort of the final authority and minimize the role of international institutions. So in a sense, we could say, yes, that supports the concept of formal anarchy.
Right. Thank you. So looking forward now, if there is a change in the U.S. government in November, or I guess in January, do you think it's going to be possible for a Biden administration to restore allies' trust in the U.S.?
So, yes, and let me first note that, and having chatted about these things before, is the election really could go either way. And it's just impossible it was impossible to predict for many people last time, but it's impossible to predict now. So I know polls indicate, so that's always something to bear in mind, is it really could go either way. Mm-hmm. I think that a Biden administration will signal to allies and to non-allies that it will be a return to the more traditional premises of U.S. foreign policy. To wit, support for NATO, for the EU, for other multilateral institutions, a willingness to work through the framework of the United Nations and other institutions like the World Health Organization. It will signal, and this is especially coming from Biden, it will signal a support for global human rights and a willingness to do more, to call out human rights violations and to support that. So I think most of our allies and non-allies would say, okay, we kind of know what this is going to mean. Maybe it'll be different than Obama, different than Bush, different than Clinton, but we generally know what it's going to mean. Now, the problem is that it's going to take a while to rebuild these institutions, number one. Number two, depending upon what happens in the Senate, the president, if Biden is in fact elected, President Biden may have great difficulties getting everything done he wants to do, because a lot of stuff is going to require support of Congress, is going to require the engagement of the Senate. Certainly if the president wants to conclude a treaty, the president would need 2/3 of the Senate in order to get the treaty concluded. So that's something, if the Senate flips, then that's going to make certain things easier. But then there's this. If I'm Angela Merkel or Justin Trudeau or whomever, or Vladimir Putin, I'm asking myself, what happens in 4 years? Sure, we know Joe Biden. We know what he does. We generally understand his foreign policy. But if the United States could elect someone who is extraordinarily non-traditional like Trump in 2016, what's to say they won't elect somebody like that in 2024? And so that's going to introduce a level of caution on the part of our allies, in that they may say, okay, yeah, we get what you're about, but if we enter into this agreement, something like the Iran agreement, how do we know that the next president won't overturn it? How do we know that the United States is speaking for anything that can be enduring beyond the current election? Now, at some level, that's always a concern. But given prior consistencies in foreign policy, I think our allies were less likely to worry. Having seen what we've had over the past 3.5 years, I think they'd be more concerned and perhaps skeptical of even a lot of things that a Biden administration would propose.
Yeah, thank you, Tony. We have a question from a participant that I think dovetails nicely with what we've just been discussing, which is given all of the challenges in the international system, how important is it that Biden pick a vice president with experience in this area, even though, of course, he himself has extensive experience?
Well, a couple things to note about this, and to be very honest, Biden is not a young man, so I think the vice presidential choice is generally going to be more significant than if it were 20 years ago. I mean, obviously, John Kennedy was a young man, so anything can happen, but I think that's going to be an important choice. So whomever he picks as vice president, she is going to have to be willing to assume that mantle. And secondly, there's a general sense that this is going to be a one-term administration, given his age and everything else, which means that person is likely, again, nothing is guaranteed, but is likely to be queued up to be a successor nominee for the Democratic Party. I don't think that you need a vice president with extensive foreign policy experience. I think what you need is a vice president who is extraordinarily bright, that does have political experience, and understands how to rely and interact with experts, and is a fast study. And I think a lot of people fall into that role that have been suggested, that are on Vice President Biden's short list. So I think there are a lot of people that would stand that, but I don't think you need to get somebody who's had extensive foreign policy experience per se.
Right.
I mean, we've had vice presidents who've had. Richard Nixon actually had a tremendous amount of foreign policy experience. Lyndon Johnson less so, for example. Biden had a lot of foreign policy experience. I mean, George Herbert Walker Bush had more foreign policy experience than just about anybody when he was vice president. So we've had Dick Cheney had serious foreign policy experience. So we've had people that had that, but I don't think that's as critical as somebody who's extraordinarily bright, who is very astute politically, and then can really rely on experts and knows who the best people are in the field, and will bring them in. Well, frankly, one of the problems with the current administration is that people that have been appointed to foreign policy related positions don't have any foreign policy experience. And if anything, you need a president and then a vice president who would recognize what they don't have in terms of experience and then bring in those people that do.
Yeah, thank you. So I have a question from a participant about the prospects for arms control in the advent of the Biden administration.
So that's a really good question. And Al, as you mentioned, this is the 75th anniversary of the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. And it is a time, I think, when many people reflect on arms control. The Trump administration has pulled back on arms control agreements, and we've seen that recently. I think in a Biden administration, again, this is sort of the traditional approach that he has taken, we would see more of an engagement in arms control. And my experience with Biden is that he supports the use of military force when necessary, but is certainly not a hawk of any kind. And I actually think he may have felt that some of President Obama's engagement in places like Libya and otherwise may have been too much. So I would see him as someone willing to use force, but also understanding that it's not the answer to every question. Couple that with an appreciation of the problem of nuclear weapons and the need to move forward on arms control agreements in a lot of areas, things like whether it's the Iran Accord or more specific engagement with Russia and potentially with China. I think he would be much more willing to do that. I also think he's going to have challenges with emerging technologies in this area, including things like fully autonomous weapons systems, which are now coming to the fore. And I think he would bring in the people who would be able to deal with those things. Now, the question is whether Russia and China and whomever are going to want to engage, given what they've seen in the past. But yes, I think he'd be much more supportive of arms control.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think you're right. I remember reading one of Bob Woodward's books, kind of in behind the scenes about the Obama administration, and I think Biden pushed for a much smaller footprint in Afghanistan at the time that ultimately the Obama administration decided on a big surge. So he's certainly not a kind of reflexive hawk of any kind.
And one thing to note about Biden, I many years ago testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. It's 1994, so many years ago. And I asserted, and I believe this, I said that I thought the president had the authority to use military force without consulting Congress in certain circumstances, quick, short uses of force that put American troops at minimal risk. I said that, and I still believe that that's part of what it means for the president to be commander-in-chief. Who jumped all over me? Joe Biden. Joe Biden took me to task, and he said, now, Professor Arend, what do you mean by that? And he was going on and on. And the reason I mentioned that is Biden has been in Congress so long, and even as president, I think his heart tells him that you need to bring Congress along in certain uses of force, and that's why he's probably been more reluctant when the president had done these things on a unilateral basis.
Yeah, thank you. So I wanted to ask you about China. Do you think that given the trade war that we've seen over the last few years and then tension over the pandemic, is the U.S.-China relationship on a fundamentally different track going forward, or can a Biden administration change course there?
So I think the answer is yes and yes. So I think it is on a fundamentally different track. I think Xi has signaled a new role for China beyond being a regional leader, wanting to be a global leader, and the Belt and Road Initiative illustrate this. The territorial actions in the South China Sea and elsewhere illustrate that. So I think without a doubt, they're on a new road and a new path. Now, that doesn't mean the United States can't engage. And I think the engagement needs to be one of competitiveness, challenge, but with a view toward promoting cooperation down the road. And this is something my colleague Matthew Koenig has argued as much, but others have made that argument. So now we're kind of in a combative, and I don't use that in a military sense, but an adversarial relationship. And you need to address that, and you need to challenge their claims. You need to challenge their human rights violations that are taking place. But the goal has to be working out an accommodation. And even if you think during the Cold War, that this is the kind of thing the United States did with the Soviet Union, is yes, we called out their human rights violations. Yes, we called out their territorial claims, but we pursued arms control and pursued other things. And I think that kind of engagement with China is really, really important. I also think that things like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which the Trump administration didn't want to engage in, were good ways to both challenge China and reassure our allies and friends in Asia of U.S.'s commitment there.
Thank you. So we're coming to the end of our time, but I wanted to ask you, kind of unfairly, given the limits of time, a big picture question. So if the U.S. Goal shouldn't be to sort of retrieve its position as a single hegemonic power, what should be the goal of U.S. foreign policy looking out over the next generation?
So I see the United States as a leader in multilateral institutions. And I've been saying that for a number of years. I think, going back to George Herbert Walker Bush, I think he wanted to do that when he was talking about this new world order, and I think he sort of wanted to engage that. But here's the way I see it, and I'm gonna simplify it. And I apologize for the simplification. If you look at some presidents that we've had, or some American pundits, they see the United States as kind of the president of the world. We're the hegemon. Okay. Well, there's another model, and that's more the, if you will, if you permit me, the prime minister of the world. And what I mean really there is, a prime minister works in a parliament. he or she has to build coalitions in that parliament to get that parliament to act. The United States continues to be the most powerful political, military, and economic force on the globe, and hopefully to many, a force for good, for a philosophy of human rights and democracy. Okay, well, rather than sort of saying it's our way or the highway, we've seen that with numerous presidents, go to the UN, go to the WHO, and say, okay, we want to play a leadership role, but we're going to work with you. We're going to build coalitions. We're going to work together. It's a different model. I think Truman, well, I think certainly Roosevelt wanted to do that. I think Truman wanted to do that. And then the Cold War came about. I think George Herbert Walker Bush wanted to do that. I think a Biden potentially could do that. But it requires an understanding that these institutions aren't going to always like you, and they're not going to always want to do what you want to do, but they're there. And if you work through them and build these coalitions, that could be a new model for American global leadership. And again, I think in a sense, that's what Roosevelt thought might happen, but it didn't because of the Cold War. And so now potentially there's a new opportunity for the United States to engage in that fashion.
Thank you. I think we're going to have to end on that hopeful note, Tony, but I want to thank you again for being here today and offering this insight. This was really fascinating, so thanks.
Thank you, Alan. Again, thanks to everybody at GU Press for all the great stuff you're doing, and thanks for all our listeners.
Well, thank you for saying that. And I wanted to let everyone know that next week we'll be talking with Stephen Miles about his book, The Torture Doctors, Human Rights Crimes and the Road to Justice. So I hope you'll join us then. And thank you again, Tony.
Thank you.
Take care. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.